Hey friend, quick pause here. If you're finding these conversations helpful, I would love to stay connected beyond the podcast. You can sign up for my free newsletter at tabithawestbrook.com. And that's where I share exclusive trauma-informed insight, faith-friendly resources, and updates on new Hey Tabby episodes, retreats, healing tools, all kinds of good stuff that you will not find anywhere else. It's one small way to keep growing together toward peace, wholeness, and freedom. Just head over to tabithawestbrook.com and click on Hey Tabby, and you will scroll down and find the newsletter sign up there. I look forward to seeing you in the emails. Welcome to Hey Tabby, the podcast where we talk about the hard things out loud with our actual lips. We'll cover all kinds of topics across the mental health spectrum, including how it intersects with the Christian faith. Nothing is off limits here, and we are not take two verses and call me in the morning. I'm Tabitha Westbrook, and I'm a licensed trauma therapist, but I'm not your trauma therapist. I'm an expert in domestic abuse and coercive control, and how complex trauma impacts our health and well-being. Our focus here is knowledge and healing. Trauma doesn't have to eat your lunch forever. There is hope. Now, let's get going. Welcome to this week's episode of Hey Tabby. I am here with somebody very neat that a lot of you who listen probably know, but I'm going to introduce him to you, and then he and I are going to chat. So joining me today is Adam Young. Adam is a therapist who focuses on trauma and abuse. He is the host of the Place We Find Ourselves podcast, which is one of my favorite podcasts. Adam is a licensed clinical social worker with a master's degree in social work from Virginia Commonwealth University and divinity from Emory University. Adam is the author of Make Sense of Your Story, Why Engaging Your Story with Kindness Changes Everything. He currently serves as a fellow and instructor at the Allender Center, and he lives in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he enjoys skiing, soccer, and mountain biking. Adam, welcome to Hey Tabby.
Thanks. It's good to be with you.
I'm super stoked to have you here. So I know about you from the podcast. I think that was my first, maybe it was my first exposure to your work, was listening to that podcast. I'm pretty sure I started listening to it before I did my narrative-focused trauma care level 1 training. And then being that you're a fellow at the Allender Center, I've heard you teach in that capacity as well. And then, of course, I read your book because who shouldn't? Everyone should. And so it's really cool to meet you and to talk with you and to get to talk to you about the work that you do, the book that you wrote, and your overall vibe of all the things. So tell me how you got into storywork to begin with.
My introduction to storywork was through Recovery Week with Dan Allender when I was in my mid-30s. Somebody gave me a copy of The Wounded Heart, which is a book that Dan wrote decades ago. And I read it, and it described the landscape of my heart. Like, it described my felt experience, day-to-day life, better than anything I had ever read. And so I went to Seattle to spend a week with the man who wrote this book that was so meaningful to me at a thing called Recovery Week, which is it's a week-long retreat for men that have a history of sexual abuse. And that was my introduction to the idea that I had a story, that my past experiences in life were profoundly influencing the way I experience the present today.
That's awesome. And I've had clients go to Recovery Week, and they have come back profoundly changed themselves. And so it's a profoundly intense and disorienting in all the right ways kind of experience, but it definitely can turn what you thought you knew upside down. Was that your experience?
That was my experience. The way I put it is that my compass was whacked. Like, what I thought was true north was in my story, namely the kindness and benevolence of my mother, turned out to be, due south. And so my compass, it was a very disorienting week in that sense, because what I thought was like my North Star turned out to be very, very different.
Yeah. So it's almost like your body knows all of these things, and when your mind catches up, it's real trippy.
Yeah.
What was it like for you to have better clarity on your story and go, oh, there is stuff here?
It was relieving. It was releasing. In other words, when things start to make sense narratively, like in the context of when our story starts to become coherent, then the symptoms that we're experiencing are also coherent. They make sense. It's like, oh, so it's like this sense of, well, no wonder. Oh, that makes so much sense now. Oh, I understand why I react that way. And so my life started to make sense. And that was very relieving.
Now, were you already a therapist at this point that you went to Recovery Week, or would that come
No,
later?
no, 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 no. I was a pastor at the time.
Okay. So what was that like as a pastor? Because I think that is something for pastors, they almost in some ways shy away from this kind of work because they think it's unimportant.
Oh, many do. Yes. Yeah. For me, it was, it couldn't be more the opposite of unimportant. It was massively important for me to come face to face with the ways that my mother had covertly sexually abused me. And so I found, what the gospel writer Luke talks about as relief. Like Jesus is sent to bring relief. I found relief, a sense of I can breathe once my story started to make sense.
I think that is such a great description of that, because I don't think a lot of people, I know in my own experience. So I had read Healing the Wounded Heart, which is the update to the Wounded Heart, and had gone through the workbook in a group that I was in and was like, wow, this is really helpful. This is really important stuff. And some of the updates to the book included a lot of the embodied pieces that we
Yes.
now know to be true, and some of the neuroscience, and even I think we know even more now. But it was my level 1 NFTC training that absolutely upended me. And I remember laying on the floor after the first weekend and wailing. And I'm not a woman given to wails.
Yes.
And I was absolutely in that spot. So
Yes.
the feeling of beginning to breathe and taking a big breath with your story resonates with me quite a bit. How have you seen that play out in the work you do? Because at some point you stopped being a pastor and became a therapist. So
Right.
tell me about that journey, because I don't think I've ever heard that before.
Well, the part of pastoring that I enjoyed the most, besides preaching, was the one-on-one heart engagement with people. So I was actually doing therapy long before I was actually a therapist. It's just the way I engaged with people. But in 2013, I transitioned from pastoral work into opening up my own therapy practice. And I began working exclusively with clients in understanding how their past was playing out in their present. And I absolutely love it, but it is a very disorienting. Therapy can be if it's done well, it's inherently a very disorienting process at the beginning. It's disorienting before it's orienting. And that's a really important thing to know when you begin the process, is that it's going to be disruptive if you're working with somebody who knows what they're doing. And if it's not disruptive, then why are you going? Like most people that go to therapy, they need the disruption because their life, or at least a part of their life, is not working. They're stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. I love to hear you say that, because I think it is something people don't always think about. So if you watch TikToks or Instagram Reels or, Snapchats, wherever you get your information, that you might see people talking about therapy as if it's always rainbows and unicorns. And there are those pieces. Like, I have a great time in my own therapy and being a therapy provider, but there are some really hard things, and it is incredibly disorienting at the beginning, because you're unweaving this basket that has been put together through however many years, maybe decades of life and ways of being, and your story. So what really helped you lean into more of the story work? Because there's a million ways to do therapy, right? There's a million ways to therapize another human, but you seem to primarily use story work. First of all, is that accurate? And secondly, what makes you rely on that maybe more than other things, or in addition to other things?
Is it accurate? I don't exclusively do what I call story work. I do a lot of internal family systems. I do a lot of somatic experiencing type, embodiment type work. I'm not trained in somatic experiencing, but I've learned a lot about how the body stores and releases trauma. And so Peter Levine, Pat Ogden, like I'm very influenced by these folks in terms of how to work with trauma in the body, because trauma is inherently embodied. It's not enscolled. It doesn't primarily reside in the left hemisphere of your brain. It primarily resides in your bodily experience. So internal family systems, somatic stuff, story work, for me, they are all elements of what I would call engaging a person holistically. And if you can't engage the person that you're sitting with holistically, something is inevitably going to be left out. Something's going to be lacking. Something's going to be missing. And so, thankfully, at this point in history, like we have access to a lot of modalities, a lot of frameworks that allow us to understand how trauma affects human beings that we frankly just didn't know 50 years ago.
Yeah. I think that's a very important point for a lot of people listening, because especially if you had developmental trauma, and I am by no means excusing the things our parents may have done in their own broken areas. And we're going to talk about that in a second, because I know you have very strong feelings on this. I've heard them in various contexts, and you write about it in your book as well. But, there wasn't as much known in the past. And so attempting to get help, for folks. So I'm solidly Gen X. I am 50. And when I went to therapy when I was a much younger woman in my early 20s, what we have now was not what we had then. And that is a very different landscape. And it leads me to give a lot of grace, not only to the past folks who have tried to do things, but even to our present selves, because we know what we know in this moment, and what we will know 10 years from now will also be different. And so there's that landscape of grace as we learn and grow. How would you talk more about that?
I would echo what you've just said. And there has been a massive change in how we understand the ways that trauma affect the brain and body. And you're right. In 10 years, we will know far more. We will have mapped out the regions of the brain that are responsible for various functions in ways that we have not yet mapped that out in 10 years. And that will be so helpful for working with people in trauma. It's not out of the question to have functional MRI types of experiences during therapy in the future. Like that's coming. And once if you can imagine doing work with a couple and they're both in an fMRI machine. In other words, you can see in real time how their emotional experience is activating certain regions of their limbic brain in vivo in the session. That will give those people so much compassion for what's happening in their bodies and why it's so hard to be in a romantic relationship. So I think, I think the advances are very kind.
As a gigantic nerd, that sounds like the most fun as a therapist, to be able to see that in real time while you're doing the work. And it reminds me of a million years ago when I started doing couples work, and we put the pulse oximeter on both couples. So you could see the heart rate and you could see the oxygen saturation, because that tells you a lot about whether someone is or is not flooded in a session.
Yes. Yep.
That would be super cool. And, I think about those things, and I know there's that balance and tension between grace and responsibility. And where I'm going with this is with our parents. And you talk a lot about there are things that are intentional. And that's hard, right? Because I've heard a lot of people say, I have said in my own life, well, they were doing the best they could. And your answer to that might be, no, it's not. No, they didn't. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, look, I don't think this is very complicated. Sometimes we do the best we can. and sometimes we don't. I don't know I don't know why this is a big deal. That is just so self-evident to me. Anyone who has parented knows that sometimes we do the best we can and sometimes we don't. And that's just what it means to be human. It's not an indictment on you, on any of us. It's just a reality that we have to confront and own and engage. So there is a thing called intentional harm. There are moments when your parents intentionally harmed you. How do you know those moments? Those are the moments where patterns emerge. Patterns of relating are intentional. Isolated incidents are isolated incidents. Patterns are not. And so if your relationship with your mother has been marked by a sense of intrusiveness or critique, or, oftentimes at the dinner table from age 6 to 16, you were experiencing some level of humiliation. Okay, that's a pattern. That's not unintentional. Patterns are intentionality manifest. So if you can put some word to what are some of the themes of how you related to your mother and to your father, you will find out where intentional harm was done. And that's very, very liberating to find language for that, because it allows you to understand why you're having the symptoms that you're having in your life. And we all have symptoms.
Absolutely. How would you address someone who says, I know there was this pattern of harm in my life. Let's say my mom and dad were harsh, they were cruel. They did absolutely none of the big six that you talk about in terms of attachment, which are some of my favorite things you've ever published. I will tell you that. And yet they say, but they were doing the best they could because of their own brokenness. How would you respond to that?
I would ask them if they're a parent. Yeah, are you yourself a parent? And if they are, and even if they're not, are you in a relationship that has some level of closeness and intimacy? Yes. Do you always do the best you can? Of course not. Have you ever intentionally harmed your children? Of course you have. Have you ever intentionally harmed your partner? Have you ever been aware of how this comment will sting my partner and said it precisely because you know it's going to hurt them? Okay. That's intentionality. That's harmful. And I don't know how anyone can be honest with themselves and not acknowledge that they have done intentional harm at times. Now, look, you've also done unintentional harm. Absolutely. There are times when I have said things to my children that have harmed them and I haven't meant to do it. That category exists also, but that's not the category that torments people. The category that torments you is the places in your background where your mother or father have done intentional harm and you have been unwilling or reluctant to look at and name that honestly, because it's too hard to bear.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Hey Tabby, and we will be right back to this episode. Here on Hey Tabby, we talk a lot about the hard stuff, trauma, abuse, and the toll that it takes on your mind, body, and spirit. And I want you to know you don't have to walk that alone. At the Journey in the Process, our team of highly trained trauma therapists help people heal from the deep wounds of complex trauma, all kinds of abuse, coercive control, sexual harm, and problematic sexual behaviors. We don't just manage symptoms. We work with your whole self, your mind, your body, and your spirit, using evidence-based approaches like EMDR, brain spotting, somatic experiencing, and internal family systems to help you find deep healing. Whether you're in North Carolina or Texas, we can meet with you in person or through secure telehealth sessions. We also have personalized intensives if you're in another area, and you can come to us in Texas or North Carolina and do that deep work over several days. Regardless of how we connect, we strive to make this a safe, judgment-free space where your story is heard, your pain is honored, and your healing is possible. If you're ready to take that next step toward peace, visit www.thejourneyandtheprocess.com, and we'll have that linked in the description as well. Trauma doesn't have to eat your lunch forever. There is hope, and we are here to help you find it. Now, let's get back to this week's episode. Yeah. It is. It's a weighty matter, right? Because then you have to hold the tension of, I love this person. They gave me life.
Yes.
Yeah, even if the life wasn't a great life, they gave me life. And especially, I would say, I see this wrestle the biggest amongst Christians, where we spiritually bypass ourselves, to say everything's fine, rainbows and unicorns. I can't, honor your mother and father. What would you say to that? I know you've spoken about honoring your mother and father. How would you respond to someone who says that they can't speak against their mother and father or can't say what really happened because it would be dishonoring?
Well, look, honor requires honesty. So my daughter said to me I'd say 2 weeks ago, Dad, you can't cry in the way that you just cried and said what you said to me in the way that you said it. That doesn't feel good to me. I don't like how you expressed that. All right. Now, look, whether she's right or wrong, and she's right. It was an honoring thing for her to say that to me. Why? Because she's telling me indirectly that she trusts I can bear it. There are few things as honoring as the truth. So if my daughter does not feel the freedom to tell me out, to say, ouch, Dad, I didn't like that. That didn't feel good. If she doesn't feel the freedom to say that to me, there are much bigger problems at play than whatever she was putting her finger on. And those bigger problems are, she has learned in her nervous system that it's not safe to express anger or disappointment at that. And that's properly called developmental trauma. So honor requires honesty. And there are a few things as honoring as telling someone else how you experience them. And that includes your parents.
Yeah. And we would do that, hopefully, ideally, with a friend, right? It gets trickier when it's our parents because there is a power differential. And, they, even if we're adults, I think we still feel that. I call it FOOBS, family of origin BS. All of the things that we carry with us and all of the dynamics that we don't even know are dynamics, oftentimes until we go away to college or become an adult and move out of the house. And then somebody tells us their story and we're like, wait, what? And you don't realize what you experienced was something maybe not as healthy or was harmful.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what's most important is not that you confront your parents by speaking to them. What gets people hung up is it's dishonoring to even name it within myself. In other words, they feel like I'm not honoring my father and mother just to acknowledge to themselves how they were harmed by their parents. My invitation to people is, long before you ever speak any of this to your mother or father, are you willing to speak it to yourself? To name it honestly as, this is what actually went down. This is what was true in my particular family when I was an 11-year-old girl with my mother. This happened. And that's a very honoring confession. Confession is always honoring. Storywork is simply another way of saying confession. And confession in the Greek is the word homo, legeo. Homo means sameness, legeo means speaking. So to confess is to speak sameness with God about what actually went down, to tell the truth.
And God doesn't minimize it, actually. That is one of the things and why I always encourage folks to have good biblical literacy. Go read it for yourself. and see what it says, because God doesn't minimize when people do harmful things, and he doesn't minimize consequences of those harmful things at times. Sometimes there's grace and a consequence doesn't get meted out, and sometimes it does. And to be able to speak the truth, right, is really, really important, especially to yourself. I love that you
Yes.
said that, because long before you say it to anybody else, you definitely have to be able to say it to you. And also that applies to the good things, not just the harmful things, because my experience in my own story work and doing story work with other people is that we also tend to minimize or spiritually bypass the good stuff and the goodness
Yeah.
that God has created in us.
Yes. I mean, most people are deeply uncomfortable with their glory, their goodness, their beauty, their splendor. And they're so uncomfortable with it that if you ask them to write on a 3x5 card, like bullet out some of the unique ways that you reflect the image of God, most people can't do it.
That is a true statement. Now, if I gave somebody a piece of paper and said, write everything you don't like, everything that's terrible, I'm going to have to go get them more paper, more than likely.
Right.
But if I ask them to do the opposite, it's much more difficult, but it's there. Our goodness, our glory, our beauty is
Yes.
there.
Yes. But people are far more ambivalent about their beauty than about their depravity.
Why do you think that is?
Because our beauty is what got us in trouble as children.
Say more words.
Well, if you look at the unique ways that you reflected the image of God as a 6-year-old boy or a 10-year-old girl, and if you can put language to the particularity of that. So, for example, for me, I was the deeply sensitive feeling boy. Well, whatever those things are for you that are glorious and beautiful about you, they got you consumed and they got you envied. In other words, you bear in your body immense torment and heartache. And it's not because you did bad things. It's because your beauty got you in trouble. Your glory got you consumed. Your dignity got you envied and hated and therefore humiliated. And so languaging the particularity of how you are a beautiful, glorious creature will put you in touch with the very things about you that have gotten you so much heartache.
Absolutely. And I think we have a lot of folks that listen to this podcast in the church, the Big C church. So across, all of Christianity and all different denominations and whatnot. And I think part of what I have seen in modern evangelicalism in particular is the worm narrative, basically like you're terrible. And
Right.
And I see why pastors and churches have done that, because of a fear of pride and not wanting people to think more highly of themselves than they ought. But that does, in fact, minimize the beauty that God created. It does minimize the goodness that we are all inherently created with. And that doesn't mean that we're not sinners in need of grace and a savior and all that jazz. But it does mean that we tend to go, well, this isn't important, or I need to focus more on the broken, and fix myself and fill in the blank, instead of going, man, God created some cool stuff about me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't disagree with anything you just said. However, I would say the primary driver behind what you call worm theology is a deep discomfort with how glorious each one of us truly is and how that glory has gotten us in trouble.
I think that's hard for some people to hear.
It is. Absolutely. Very hard to come to terms with, but it's not past tense. Whatever got you consumed and hated as a child is still at play in your life, and it is still bracing still because of those very things. Your innocence, your sensitivity, your gifting Whatever your gifting is, you can follow that like a trail that will take you into the ways you have been harmed. Follow your gifting and you will see how you have been assaulted by evil.
I think that is an interesting thing. So just to back up for a second, even talking about this, even though I agree with you, it feels dangerous to talk about. Like in my own body right
Absolutely.
now, you know, like,
Yeah.
oh, what are we doing? What are we talking about? And,
Yes.
you know, but mapping out your gifting with your harm, man, that sounds like a great therapeutic exercise, actually, to take a real
Mhm.
look at it.
Yeah. I mean, all that is, it's another way of saying story work. Story work is simply looking at how your beauty, your glory, your gifting has been assaulted from the time you came out of the womb until today. And when you can see that, and you can see what you have done with your own beauty, so many people have attempted to hide their glory so that they can manage envy. If
Yeah.
I don't look so big, they won't come after me. That's the idea. And and I get it. I mean, this affects everything from mindset to body posture. I can't tell you how many people I work with who have their shoulders rolled forward, their head, their chest kind of caved in so that they are less visible to the outside world, so that they won't be consumed and they won't be envied.
Yeah. And I want to contrast this because we have a lot of survivors of domestic abuse. So, where they have been absolutely brutally harmed by their usually husband for the people that I work with, but it can be wives as well. And I think what we're talking about is a little bit different than that, in that there's a whole other set of problems happening. Because what I'm concerned about for the audience is going, well, isn't it prideful too? Right. And in an abusive, coercively controlling individual, pride is at play, like a very problematic version of pride and entitlement. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about hiding who God made you to be so that you will not be preyed upon. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. Mhm. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I just like to contrast that because sometimes people don't explicitly say that. And then abusers or coercive controllers will get a hold of stuff like this and go, see, it's you, see, it's you. And I just want to be really mindful because I have seen that play out so many times. And I know my audience really well. So I just want to be very, very careful in how we talk about that because every victim of abuse that I've ever met has said, oh, I must have done something. It
Right.
must have been me.
Right. Right.
And that's not the case.
Right. Yeah. And the tendency to say it must have been me in a domestic violence situation is always learned. In other words, there's a predisposition in the nervous system based on your experiences growing up to turn on yourself so that you don't have to look with eyes wide open at the horror of what's being done to you.
Yeah. It's almost, in a sense, sometimes, this is going to sound tricky, easier than looking at it for real, because that means you have to reckon with the person that you're married to is maybe a monstrous, and
Yes.
that that some of what you may have been led to believe about a lot of things, this is where I hear in the church a lot, God hates divorce and all of those things, which are taken wildly out of context, completely misinterpreted.
Right.
And you have to look at then also your doctrine, what you believe, and that can be very unsettling for people.
Right. But in domestic violence situations, I mean, before it's cognitive, it's like the emotional nervous system inclination to protect. Like, I don't feel safe staying and I don't feel safe leaving. And
Yeah.
for lots of women, that's a reality. Like, I can't stay, but I can't leave. And that puts you in a horrible bind.
It is. It is a terrible bind. And there's enormous amounts of ambivalence in that space.
Right.
How do you think understanding your story can help set people free, whether they leave or go? Because that's up to them.
Well, I mean, understanding how you came to be in a relationship with someone who does such harm to you without remorse or without repentance or without like a feeling in his gut of, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just did that to you, sweetheart. Like, how is it that you came to be in a relationship with someone who is violent towards you? Because there's a reason for that. And you need to understand that reason. It's not saying you made the wrong decision. It's simply saying, hey, there was something about this person that felt like home to me. All right. There's a reason for that. And that reason is rooted in your story and your family of origin. And understanding that can not only release you to leave, but it can help you have compassion of, oh my gosh, no wonder I've been in this situation for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a disentangling when we look at our story and we go, oh my gosh, we do have to start pulling at threads and disentangle the pieces that have led us into those places of harm. And again, this is not victim blaming at all. Absolutely nobody I've ever met was like, I'd love to get married and have it be completely abusive and absolutely have my world turned into terror. No one does that ever. Not least not anybody I've met. Maybe there's one person on the world, but there is that, like, let me disentangle how this has shaped me. Let me disentangle. And sometimes that is then learning about what our own goodness is, because we've been led to believe through gaslighting, through having our personhood chipped away, that there is no goodness, there is no glory, there is no beauty, that you're just a problem. And if your church, unfortunately, also perpetuates that, and some do, in abuse situations where they do not help out, then you have to disentangle a lot. And that's hard.
Yes. Yeah.
What led you to finally write your book?
I couldn't keep it in any longer. There were words inside of me that needed to get not just communicated via a microphone and a podcast, but in a book requires you to put in more of a coherent framework, a collective kind of exhaustive treatment of a particular subject. And for me, that subject was, hey, if you're at all curious about looking at how your past is affecting your present, here's a book that will take you by the hand and guide you through that journey of understanding where you came from. In other words, making sense of your story. So I wrote the book because, I was going to burst.
I understand that feeling. And how has it, since its release, because it's been out for a little bit, how has it impacted your life and the lives of people that you talk with? Like, what's it been like for you since it's been out in the world?
Occasionally I'll get, people will email me or come up to me and let me know that it has moved them deeply. And what that does for me is it gives me a sense of, like, I can die now. Like, there's a sense in which you feel satiated that you're doing the work that you were put on earth to do. Like, there's a tremendous feeling of fulfillment and meaning in that.
Yeah, definitely. What is one thing you want folks, if they haven't picked up your book, and I recommend that they do, I really like your book. What is one thing you hope that they walk away with after they read it or listen to it if they audible things?
Yeah. The vision is that at some point in reading the book, they will put the book down and begin writing their own stories. So what I hope people do is, like, I'd be thrilled if they never finish it, because they get preoccupied with taking their own stories, plural, because we have many of them, seriously enough to write them down and begin exploring those formative memories that we still remember. You may not be sure why, but you've never forgotten that thing that happened when you were 10. And you write it down, and then you take the risk of reading it to a trained, wise guide who can take you deeper into what actually happened. That's the goal. That's the hope.
Absolutely. I love that. And I will say, this is the very first story I ever walked through with someone was in my NFTC one. And I remember I was like, I don't know these women. I don't know what's happening. And so I was like, oh man, I'm going to bring a benign story. It'll have some stuff, but it'll be a benign story. And I was engaging, like my group was engaging me. I had a fantastic facilitator who I absolutely adore, still love her so much. And I remember them finding these deep depths that I didn't even know was there. And as they helped me engage my story, I was just like, oh, that wasn't a lightweight story at all.
Right. That's right. That's right. We all tend to minimize our stories. Why? Because it was just normal for us. It's the way it was. It didn't feel 3 standard deviations outside the norm. It felt smack dab in the middle of the bell curve because for us, it was normal. It's what we experienced all the time. That's why when you read your story to others and you hear their reaction, you begin to understand your story more accurately. None of us know our stories when we write them. We don't know what we're writing because we were too close to it.
Yeah. And I think one thing I want to highlight here is we are talking about writing out your story and then sharing it. And that is incredibly powerful. It's more than just me telling you the narrative, right? So I can come sit across from you in your office. I could tell you a story, but when I have to write it down and then read it out loud with another, person present with me or in a group, holy cow, that is a different experience. And the writing of it is a different experience.
Absolutely.
What would you say to someone who's like, I don't know if I could do that. I'm really scared.
Oh, I would say, I get that. That makes sense. That makes sense. I would not want anyone to begin to write until they're ready. And you might find yourself in a different place in 3 months than you are today. So if it's too overwhelming today, what I would say is write a story that's less overwhelming. In other words, begin the process of exploring something that doesn't feel as daunting rather than kind of waiting until you're ready to tell the worst story. Start with the small, what you perceive as less painful, and see where that takes you. But start writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also say finding a story coach, a guide, a therapist that knows how to do this work. Because when we are with someone who is safe, where our bodies feel the safety with them, it is a lot easier. I won't say it's easy. It's not easy, but it's easier to share that story and to also write knowing I don't have to hold this alone. I think when people try to start on their own to write, when they know that there's been deep harm and they're not even sure where to go, it can feel really scary to be like, what am I even going to do with this? And I would encourage you to get into a group or get in with a coach or a therapist that knows this work to share that, because you do need to be held for sure.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
I know in my own story, I have a pretty significant history of sexual harm, which is now in a book. And so it's out there on the internet and whatnot. But the very first way I ever shared it was I had to write it and read it to my therapist. And it's not something he had asked me to do at the time, but it's something I knew I can't say this out loud if I don't write it first. And it was my work, with story work in the past that made me feel like, yeah, this is the way to do it. And to have someone turn their face toward me. When I was talking about my deepest shame was one of the most healing things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's true for every single person, whether you have a history of sexual harm or not. You have a history of harm. And everyone has some level of sexual harm. It may not be sexual abuse. It may not be sexual violation, but you have places in your story that bear sexual shame. Those stories need to be told. And when someone is with you in those places of shame and they can turn their face toward you, lots of good healing things happen neurobiologically.
Absolutely.
We're made for that level of attunement.
We are. And that is how God attunes to us. I
Yes.
think about Jim Wilder, who I heard interviewed. He wrote some really great books as well, talking about how we can rephrase scripture as God has turned his face toward. God has turned his face toward.
Yeah.
And that is powerful, especially when we think this is so shameful. What will you think of me when you hear it? What will you
Right.
think of me? And we want to be wanted, right? Kirk Thompson says we come into the world looking for others, looking for us. And if I say something and I think you're going to turn your face away from me, like others have, like my family did, like my spouse has, whoever's harmed you, then it can be really scary. But when the right folks hear it, the people who have honor, integrity, who are filled with the Spirit, look at you and say, oh my gosh. And they turn their face toward you. That is unsettling because it's terrifying to be seen. And it's beautiful and it's healing.
Yes. All of the above.
What is, as we close out here today, something like, what is it that's just you would love to share with my audience? Anything that comes to mind. It can literally be about this stuff or anything else altogether.
Just to take whatever the next step is for you, listener, to explore your story, like take that step. It can be a small step, but whatever is coming as you're listening, whatever's coming up for you as, oh, maybe I could try that. Or, oh, I remember that story. Maybe I could write that one. Or, oh, I know about this storywork coach or this therapist. Maybe I could reach out to him or her. Like whatever that next step is, like walk through that door. Why? Because you deserve care. Your story deserves witness. You need, and that's not a bad word, you need support. You're made for that. And you deserve it.
We are, in fact, made for community. And I will say, this is something I say often, healing happens in community. It really does. In a healthy community, a good community, healing is inevitable in a lot of ways. Adam, thank you so much for being here. We will have all of your contact information. We will have a link to your book in the show notes. And I really would commend folks, please buy this book if you haven't already. And please read it. I will say Adam does read it on the Audible version, on the audio version, which I love. I love when the authors read their own books. And honestly, you have such a distinctive cadence and way of saying things that if it had been anybody else, I don't know what I would have done when I listened to it. I'd have been like, no, that's not right.
Right.
But it is fantastic. Also, check out the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. If you have worked with me at all in the past, you know when certain things come up, I'm like, go listen to this episode of The Place We Find Ourselves. It's really going to be helpful. We can talk about it. I've actually even used it with supervisees to talk through different things and how we might language them. So I'm grateful for your podcast and grateful for the work that you do. As someone who has been a student of the Allender Center, I'm grateful for the teaching I've been able to receive in that space and from you. You've done some of my favorite sessions in the narrative-focused trauma care. No shade to anybody else, but I did enjoy them. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us and the audience on Hey Tabby. And I hope that everybody will join us again next time. Thanks for joining me for today's episode of Hey Tabby. If you're looking for a resource that I mentioned in the show and you want to check out the show notes, head on over to tabithawestbrook.com/Hey Tabby. That's HEYTABI, and you can grab it there. I look forward to seeing you next time. Hey friend, can I ask you something kind of personal? Have you ever wondered if healing your sexuality was even possible after everything you've been through? If you have, you're not alone. That is exactly why I wrote Body and Soul Healed and Whole, an invitational guide to healthy sexuality after trauma, abuse, and coercive control. This book is for every Christian woman who has been harmed sexually, whether that happened in childhood, adulthood, or even within your coercively controlling marriage, and you're longing to feel safe in your body again. We talk about the hard stuff: shame, desire, faith, and even questions like, is this sin or is this trauma? You don't have to untangle it alone. If you've ever wished for a guide that is honest, compassionate, and grounded in both scripture and trauma-informed care, and does not spiritually bypass, Body and Soul, Healed and Whole is for you. It's available now wherever books are sold. Go grab your copy today. You are so worth the healing.